December 1944. Somewhere along the frozen backroads of Belgium, dawn breaks through a haze of drifting fog. The countryside is silent, too silent. Frost clings to hedgerows, the air thick with smoke and the scent of burning fuel. German half-tracks roll forward in single file, engines growling beneath sheets of gray mist. Their crews are confident. Word among them is simple. The Americans' tin toys are no threat, especially those six-wheeled scouts with paper armor, the so-called M8 Greyhounds. But down the road, hidden behind the wreck of a barn, 3 of those same toys lie in wait. Their engines are cold, their crews whispering through cracked radios. The gunner's hand rests steady on the 37mm cannon's breech. He doesn't breathe as a half-track's outline begins to form in the fog. Then one flash. A deafening crack shatters the morning stillness. The first shell punches through the German column. Metal screams, men shout, and arrogance dies in seconds. The Germans had mocked the Greyhound. They wouldn't laugh again. By the time the M8 Greyhound first rolled into service in 1943, the United States Army had already learned one bitter lesson from North Africa. Speed and information often mattered more than armor. In those open desert battles, tank columns frequently outmaneuvered one another long before shots were fired. Whoever saw first, struck first. That principle shaped the next phase of American armored thinking. What the U.S. needed wasn't another heavy tank. It needed eyes, fast, mobile, expendable eyes. The Ford Motor Company responded with a compact six-wheeled vehicle built around that philosophy. The M8 light armored car was born. At first glance, it looked unimpressive. Thinly armored, weighing barely over 7.5 tons, with an open-top turret and a small 37mm gun that looked more like an antique compared to the cannons mounted on Shermans or German Panzers. But the Greyhound, as it was nicknamed, wasn't built to duel tanks. It was built to move, and move fast. Its 110-horsepower Hercules engine could push it to over 55 miles per hour on roads, faster than most tracked vehicles of the era. When it arrived in Europe, even some American soldiers doubted it. Compared to the rugged half-tracks they were used to, the M8 looked delicate. One burst from an 88mm gun, and it would vanish in smoke. Still, doctrine dictated that reconnaissance units had to push ahead, find enemy positions, and radio back, not fight. The Greyhound's combination of speed, maneuverability, and long-range radio made it perfect for that role. German troops, on the other hand, dismissed it entirely. In 1943 and early 1944, reports from the Eastern Front and Italy described small-wheeled scout cars that posed no serious danger. Wehrmacht commanders joked that the Americans sent cars to fight tanks. To them, the M8 was a curiosity, a sign of Allied inexperience with armored warfare. But that perception wouldn't last long. As the war dragged into the brutal campaigns of 1944, the Greyhound began to earn its reputation in a far deadlier environment. The tight hedgerows of Normandy and the muddy backroads of France. Reconnaissance squadrons learned to use terrain, timing, and radio coordination to compensate for their vehicles' weaknesses. They never charged head-on. They scouted, observed, and relayed, often miles ahead of the main force. Still, battlefields had a way of rewriting doctrine. When infantry units came under sudden attack, Greyhound crews frequently found themselves forced to fight, ambushing enemy transports, strafing convoys, or holding crossroads long enough for reinforcements to arrive. In those moments, the little 37mm cannon proved its worth. Against German half-tracks, armored cars, and light vehicles, it was deadly accurate. Its high-velocity shells could pierce up to 60mm of armor at close range. More than enough to rip through the side plating of a SD, KFZ, 251, or the turret of a Panzer II. The Germans started to take notice. The very weapon they had mocked as underpowered was suddenly disabling their supply columns. Greyhound crews became known for appearing where they shouldn't, striking fast, disappearing faster. The recon units of the U.S. 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions in France developed entire tactics around hit-and-run engagements, using speed and coordination instead of brute strength. But the vehicle's success wasn't just in combat. It was in communication. Each M8 carried a powerful SCR 508 radio, allowing crews to feed constant intelligence back to headquarters. That link often decided whether Allied tank battalions walked into an ambush or set one instead. The M8's crew became the invisible eyes of advancing divisions, unseen yet indispensable. As 1944 progressed and the Allies pushed deeper into occupied Europe, the Greyhound's role expanded. It was used for convoy escort, forward artillery spotting, and even urban patrols. Though its thin armor left it vulnerable to anything heavier than a machine gun, experienced crews treated it like a ghost, never staying still, never fighting from the same position twice. By autumn, reports from German officers grew less dismissive. Commanders who once laughed now issued warnings about fast American armored cars capable of striking with precision. Small, quiet, and coordinated, they began to fear what they couldn't predict. And as the front lines shifted toward the Ardennes, the stage was set for the ultimate test, where speed, stealth, and nerve would collide head-on with German armor. The winter fog of 1944 was closing in. The Greyhound would soon have to prove its worth against more than just mockery. The Ardennes Offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge, was supposed to be the death knell of Allied momentum. In December 1944, Hitler's armies launched a desperate surprise counterattack through the dense forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. The goal was audacious: split the Allied line, seize Antwerp, and crush the Western Front in one final strike. For the men of the U.S. Army scattered across those cold forests, the shock was instant. Many units were cut off, isolated, and blind to the scale of the attack. That's when the M8 Greyhound came into its own. Its original design, for reconnaissance, not battle, suddenly became critical. The German Blitz depended on surprise and speed. The only way to counter it was with faster intelligence. Greyhound crews found themselves driving into chaos, dodging ambushes, slipping through enemy lines, and reporting the positions of armored columns before they could encircle Allied divisions. The light car's agility allowed it to weave through blocked roads, forest paths, and shelled villages where heavier tanks couldn't go. But this wasn't the first time the Greyhound had been tested under fire. Months earlier, during the drive across France, the 82nd Reconnaissance Battalion had already learned the hard way that mobility meant survival. They'd used their M8s to track retreating German forces, harass convoys, and guide Shermans to soft spots in enemy defenses. That experience would pay off in the Ardennes, where the terrain punished armor and rewarded speed. German units, particularly those fielding Panzer IVs and Tiger I tanks, viewed the M8 as an afterthought. They believed only a tank could kill a tank, a doctrine drilled into the Wehrmacht since the early Blitzkrieg days. But reality on the battlefield was different. The Germans' most vulnerable assets weren't always tanks. They were the vehicles that kept those tanks moving: the half-tracks, fuel trucks, and supply convoys. The Greyhound's 37mm gun couldn't pierce a Tiger's front plate, but it could shred the armored walls of a half-track or ignite a fuel carrier with precision. And that kind of destruction crippled entire panzer formations. The irony was bitter. The same German officers who dismissed the M8 as a scout car soon found their supply lines cut apart by them. The Greyhound's ambush tactics worked best at night or in fog, exactly the conditions that dominated the Ardennes. Small recon teams, often 3 or 4 vehicles, would hide along forest roads or behind farm walls, engines off, waiting for sound before sight. Once the rumble of tracks echoed through the trees, they'd strike, firing quick, coordinated volleys, then vanishing before the Germans could react. Still, the M8 had its limits. Its thin armor, barely 19mm at its thickest, could be pierced even by rifle-caliber rounds at close range. Shrapnel from artillery was a constant threat, and the open turret left crews vulnerable to airbursts and snipers. To survive, M8 crews became masters of terrain. They used ditches, smoke, and reverse slopes to mask movement. Veteran drivers could thread the car through a bombed-out street faster than any tracked vehicle, often turning tight corners with inches to spare. The American doctrine around the M8 evolved rapidly. Initially seen as a reconnaissance tool, it became a flexible platform for communication, artillery spotting, and emergency fire support. In many divisions, Greyhound units operated independently, detached from armored regiments, reporting directly to command posts. This autonomy gave them an edge. They could move faster than the bureaucracy of war. In contrast, German reconnaissance units were faltering. Years of attrition on the Eastern Front had drained their experienced crews and vehicles. By late 1944, most Wehrmacht divisions lacked the fast, well-equipped recon formations that had once defined Blitzkrieg. Their surviving armored cars, like the SD, KFZ, 222 and 234 series, were outnumbered and often outgunned. The Germans who encountered the M8 in Western Europe weren't fighting with the same elite mechanized strength of 1940. They were fighting tired, undersupplied, and overstretched, which made the M8 speed even more devastating. Meanwhile, the Americans were refining coordination between air, artillery, and ground reconnaissance. When a Greyhound spotted enemy armor, it could instantly radio coordinates to nearby fighter bombers or artillery batteries. The result was devastatingly efficient. Within minutes, German convoys could be reduced to burning wrecks. That synergy, speed, communication, and accuracy gave Allied forces the strategic edge that pure armor never could. By the winter of 1944, the M8 Greyhound had transformed from an underestimated scout to a weapon of disruption. Its crews no longer saw themselves as mere observers. They were hunters, the first to see and often the first to strike. German troops began referring to them not as cars, but as light tanks. A reluctant respect had formed. The mockery faded, and as the Battle of the Bulge raged through the Ardennes, the Greyhound would meet the moment that forever defined its legacy. When a handful of paper-armored scouts stood their ground against one of the most feared armies in the world. The men who crewed the M8 Greyhound knew exactly what they were getting into, a vehicle built for speed, not safety. Inside that cramped steel shell, the thin armor offered only the illusion of protection. A burst from an MG-42 could slice through its sides, and a well-placed artillery shell could turn it into a coffin in seconds. Yet, every morning, those crews rolled forward. The human angle. They were often the first to enter unknown territory, the eyes and ears of advancing divisions. Most were in their early 20s, barely older than boys, but seasoned by months of reconnaissance missions. They learned quickly that hesitation got you killed. The driver, gunner, and commander functioned like one nervous system, silent, alert, perfectly synchronized. Every sound mattered, a twig snapping, an echo in the fog, the faint rattle of treads somewhere ahead. They had no armor to hide behind, only instincts and speed. For them, courage wasn't about charging enemy lines. It was about not flinching when you were told to move into areas everyone else avoided. Recon units were expendable. Their losses rarely made headlines. Many crews painted small talismans or names on their Greyhounds. Lucky Lady, Hard 8, Ghost. They weren't acts of bravado, but superstition. When your vehicle could be shredded by a single 20mm shell, you clung to anything that felt like control. The psychological strain was constant. Every bend in the road might conceal an ambush. A single hit could turn the turret into a furnace. Yet, what kept them moving wasn't blind bravery, it was discipline. The crews trusted their training, trusted their radios, and trusted that their speed could buy them one more second of survival. The tactical angle. Tactically, the M8 Greyhound wasn't supposed to fight head-to-head, but war rarely sticks to doctrine. On paper, it was a reconnaissance car. In practice, it was a shape-shifting weapon. Its greatest strength was agility. The Greyhound's independent suspension and six-wheel drive allowed it to maneuver through mud, snow, and debris with remarkable stability. It could climb steep gradients and cross rough fields faster than heavier half-tracks. Reconnaissance units used this to their advantage. Instead of engaging, they observed and reported, using binoculars, maps, and their SCR 508 radio to relay coordinates in real time. A well-placed call from an M8 could direct artillery or airstrikes that destroy targets far beyond the Greyhound's reach. In that sense, its 37mm gun was only half its power. The other half was invisible communication. The Americans developed bounding reconnaissance tactics where two or more M8s worked in tandem. One advanced, the other covered. They alternated movement, constantly feeding each other's blind spots. If enemy armor appeared, they'd scatter, draw fire, and transmit positions before disappearing behind cover. That level of coordination frustrated German units, who struggled to pin them down. The Greyhound's 37mm M6 gun might have seemed underpowered against tanks, but it was devastating against the kind of targets it actually faced: half-tracks, light armored cars, motorcycles, and infantry in cover. With armor-piercing shells, it could penetrate up to 60mm of armor at close range, enough to destroy the side plating of a German SD, KFC 251, or even damage a Panzer III under the right conditions. Its high explosive rounds could blast soft targets or fortified machine gun nests. And then there was its coaxial .30 caliber Browning and a roof-mounted .50 cal heavy machine gun, a weapon that turned the M8 into a dangerous anti-infantry platform. In the hands of skilled crews, that .50 cal could tear through buildings, trucks, or fleeing troops with shocking efficiency. German infantry learned quickly not to underestimate a Greyhound's bite. The U.S. Army began to rethink how it categorized the vehicle. While reconnaissance remained its main purpose, the M8 started being used in screening operations, flank protection, and even convoy defense. Its speed made it ideal for sudden counterattacks against small enemy probes. In Italy, M8s often worked alongside British Daimler and Humber armored cars, forming mixed recon patrols that blended speed and communication. In France, they became the backbone of cavalry reconnaissance groups, mobile scouts who could move faster than tanks, radio faster than infantry, and survive longer than jeeps. But the most dangerous missions came at night. Under blackout conditions, M8 crews would advance miles ahead of friendly lines, guided only by faint moonlight and compass bearings. The silence was oppressive. Every creak of suspension or rattle of equipment felt deafening. The men knew that if they were discovered, they'd never have time to turn and run. Still, they went, because without them, the main columns were blind. Their work rarely earned medals or fame, but their impact was enormous. The intelligence gathered by M8 reconnaissance squadrons shaped battlefield decisions from Normandy to the Rhine. They spotted ambushes, exposed artillery batteries, and intercepted retreating German columns. Every destroyed convoy or disrupted supply route started with a set of coordinates whispered through a Greyhound radio. Behind the tactical precision was a brutal truth. Reconnaissance was gambling with death for the sake of knowledge. The crews didn't fight for glory. They fought for clarity, to make sure the next Allied unit didn't drive into a trap. That mindset, calm, methodical, selfless, defined the men who sat inside those thin steel walls. And soon, that discipline would be tested in the most unforgiving conditions imaginable, where terrain, weather, and enemy fire blurred into a single storm of chaos: the technological angle. The M8 Greyhound was a product of American industrial pragmatism, designed not to be perfect, but to be built fast, cheap, and in overwhelming numbers. Ford engineers developed it in just over a year, adapting commercial car production techniques to military needs. Unlike the complex armored vehicles of Germany, the M8 was simple. It had a welded steel hull, 6 rubber-tired wheels, and a rear-mounted Hercules JXD engine. Nothing fancy, just reliability in motion. That simplicity became its strength. It could be produced in massive quantities, over 8,500 units by the end of the war, and maintained easily in the field. The Greyhound didn't need special parts or complex tools. It could be repaired with the same wrenches and spare components used on trucks. That logistical efficiency gave U.S. reconnaissance units something the Germans couldn't match: consistent mobility. Its 37mm M6 gun was considered obsolete by 1944 standards, yet its effectiveness came from speed and accuracy rather than brute force. The weapon had a quick reload cycle, a stable recoil system, and excellent optics for short-range engagements. Against German half-tracks or armored cars, it was lethal. Even light tanks like the Panzer II or early-model Stuarts couldn't withstand a direct hit from its armor-piercing shells. The Greyhound's real innovation, however, was its communication suite. The SCR 508 radio set transformed it from a light combat vehicle into a mobile nerve center. With reliable signal range and voice clarity, it could relay real-time intelligence to command posts miles away, long before aerial reconnaissance or infantry scouts could confirm positions. In modern warfare terms, it was the Wi-Fi of the battlefield, small, fast, and connected. But every innovation came with a compromise. The M8's open turret left its crew exposed to artillery fragments and snipers. Its thin armor, just 9.5mm on the sides, meant even heavy machine guns could rip through it. And while it was fast on roads, rough terrain could break axles or shred tires if driven recklessly. Yet these flaws forced ingenuity. Crews reinforced weak points with sandbags, extra track links, or spare wheels. Some even welded steel plates from destroyed German vehicles onto their turrets. Despite its limitations, the M8 represented the future of mechanized reconnaissance, mobility, and communication over armor and firepower. Where the Germans spent resources on heavy tanks, the Americans invested in vehicles that multiplied their situational awareness. That choice didn't just shape battles. It shaped doctrine for decades to come. The enemy angle. From a German perspective, the M8 was both an irritation and a warning. At first, they laughed. Early encounters in Italy and France were easy. One burst from a Panzer's main gun could obliterate a Greyhound. But as the war wore on, and German supply chains began to collapse, the tables turned. German convoys started getting hit by fast raiding cars that appeared from nowhere, struck, and vanished before Luftwaffe patrols could respond. The Wehrmacht intelligence reports began referring to light armored cars with radios capable of directing artillery with frightening precision. They weren't impressed by its armor. They feared its coordination. A single M8 could trigger an artillery strike that wiped out an entire supply column. Worse, the Greyhounds often operated in pairs or trios, making them harder to track and ambush. German troops learned that when one was spotted, another was usually nearby, watching, reporting, guiding fire. Captured reports from 1944 reveal how frontline German commanders began advising troops to engage M8s only with superior numbers or from ambush. They knew direct chases were pointless. The M8's speed meant it could retreat before a Panzer column could even traverse its turret. The arrogance that once fueled jokes about tin cars turned into frustration and fear. The M8's unpredictability broke the rhythm of German operations. It forced them to slow down, double-check routes, and conserve fuel, all while Allied forces tightened the noose around Germany's Western Front. The psychological angle. Arrogance had been one of the German army's most fatal habits. Their early blitzkrieg victories had created an illusion of invincibility. Anything smaller, lighter, or less armored seemed beneath their notice. But war has a way of punishing contempt. The M8 Greyhound became a symbol of that lesson. To Allied soldiers, it embodied resilience, proof that intelligence and precision could triumph over brute force. To the Germans, it became a reminder that speed and adaptability could be deadlier than steel. Even the psychological shock of being ambushed by a supposedly harmless vehicle eroded confidence. Troops who once dismissed the Greyhound began reporting phantom sightings of American scout tanks in areas miles from any U.S. position. Fear filled the gaps where facts ended. That fear changed behavior. German units began diverting armored cars and Panzer grenadiers just to hunt down M8 patrols, wasting resources chasing ghosts. Meanwhile, the Greyhounds continued their silent work, scouting, reporting, cutting lines. In the end, the M8 didn't win battles by itself. It changed how they were fought. It proved that information, delivered fast and accurately, could be more decisive than any gun. And it taught every army that underestimating an enemy, any enemy, was the first step toward defeat. That realization would come to a brutal head in one particular engagement, where German troops finally understood what the toy car could do when cornered and provoked. The day arrogance met reality, by midday, the battlefield had become a graveyard of smoking wrecks. The Greyhounds that survived the first wave were running low on ammunition, fuel, and luck. One of them, Able II, had lost its gunner to shrapnel and was down to the driver and commander. But they refused to back off. Through the cracked periscope, the commander spotted a narrow farm lane running parallel to the German advance. A perfect flanking route if they were fast enough and insane enough to try it. Without waiting for orders, they gunned the engine and charged down the path, mud splattering across the hull. The roar of the little six-wheeled scout car echoed through the trees as it swung around behind the enemy formation. What happened next was pure chaos. The Greyhound opened fire into the rear of a German column, hitting a fuel truck that went up like a fireball. Flames engulfed several half-tracks, blocking the road and throwing the German line into confusion. In those few minutes of hell, Able II became a ghost in the enemy's rear, shooting, relocating, vanishing before the Germans could react. The crew's desperation turned into strategy. Every shot wasn't just about damage. It was about fear and disruption. Radio operators back at command later said that the sudden explosion and erratic German movements made it seem like an entire American tank unit had ambushed them. That illusion gave U.S. forces precious time to bring in Shermans and anti-tank guns, which finished what the Greyhound started. But the cost was brutal. Able II never made it back. When the smoke cleared, the burned-out remains of the scout car were found near the tree line. Its guns still pointed toward the road, its last shell spent. The commander's body was slumped over the radio, the headset still on. His final transmission was short, almost drowned out by static. "We've got their flank. Hit them now." Those words became legend among the armored cavalry. The M8 Greyhound, once mocked as a paper-thin scout car, had just outplayed one of the most feared Panzer divisions in Normandy. When the guns finally fell silent and the smoke began to clear, the field around St. Lo told a story that would spread through the ranks faster than any official report. Scattered among the wreckage of German armor were the twisted remains of several M8 Greyhounds, machines that had no business standing up at tanks, yet had done exactly that. Infantrymen who later moved through the area found empty shell casings piled inside the scout cars, scorched radios still humming with static, and maps marked with pencil lines showing exactly where the crews had held their ground. What struck everyone wasn't the destruction they caused. It was the defiance. The Greyhounds hadn't won by firepower. They'd won by audacity and nerve. Word of the engagement reached higher command within days. Reports from reconnaissance units described how the light scouts had delayed a German Panzer thrust long enough for reinforcements to secure the sector. Officers who had once dismissed the M8 as little more than a mobile observation post started rethinking its purpose. The 37mm gun, once considered outdated, had proven its worth when paired with speed, positioning, and guts. It wasn't about armor thickness anymore. It was about brains, communication, and timing. The Greyhound crews had shown that mobility could be just as lethal as armor if used with precision. Among the surviving soldiers, there was a shift in attitude. The men who once joked about driving cardboard cans began painting kill rings on their turrets and giving their vehicles names. Each Greyhound became a badge of pride, a symbol of how far courage could push thin steel and light guns. Even enemy prisoners reportedly spoke with a grudging respect, referring to the small, fast American scouts that appeared from nowhere and vanished like smoke. In the brutal arithmetic of war, the M8 Greyhound had earned a reputation far beyond its design. The legacy of the M8 Greyhound was not written in production numbers or battlefield trophies. It was written in the sudden shift of military thinking that followed its unlikely victories. After engagements like those in Belgium and Normandy, the U.S. Army began to see that reconnaissance was no longer just about observation. It was about shaping the battlefield before the main force ever arrived. The Greyhound had proven that speed, stealth, and initiative could hold as much strategic weight as armor and firepower. Reports from frontline commanders filtered back to ordnance divisions and doctrine schools. Small, mobile vehicles had become force multipliers. They were the eyes and ears of advancing divisions, and, when necessary, their teeth. This changed not only how the U.S. operated in Europe, but how post-war militaries worldwide viewed armored reconnaissance. The British Humber, the Soviet BA-64, and later Cold War-era scout cars all carried echoes of the M8's lessons. Light, fast, agile, and capable of striking when least expected. For the crews, that legacy was personal. Veterans who had once driven those rolling tin cans spoke years later of the pride they felt, not in the machine's strength, but in how it forced them to think, adapt, and fight smart. Many became instructors or tank commanders in Korea and Vietnam, carrying the same doctrine the Greyhound had taught them. Never let size dictate courage, and never underestimate maneuver. Even German officers, reviewing the war's postmortems, acknowledged that light American units often disrupted their armored movements far more effectively than expected. One Panzer report called them the mosquito in the storm, small, irritating, impossible to swat, yet capable of turning momentum against the attacker. The M8 had started as a scout car. By the war's end, it had become a symbol of tactical ingenuity and a reminder that adaptability, not brute strength, wins battles. After 1945, as the guns went silent and armies began dissecting what had gone right or wrong, the M8 Greyhound's reputation only grew. It wasn't a star like the Sherman or the Tiger, but among the men who understood war's subtleties, reconnaissance officers, logistics planners, forward observers, the M8 became a quiet legend. In war colleges and tactical manuals, its missions were cited as textbook examples of mobility warfare: strike, withdraw, report, and exploit. During the early Cold War, many nations adopted or copied the Greyhound. France used them in Indochina, where jungle ambushes once again proved that light armor, combined with sharp tactics, could dominate terrain that heavy tanks couldn't even reach. Portugal used them in Africa, Colombia, Italy, and the Philippines kept them rolling into the 1970s. Each army repainted the chassis, bolted on new radios or guns, but the essence stayed the same, a machine that rewarded cunning over brute force. Historians later pointed out that the M8's story marked the transition from the old era of massed armor to a new age of reconnaissance warfare. It was a symbol of flexibility, a reminder that information and mobility could shape outcomes just as decisively as firepower. And perhaps most importantly, it embodied the mindset that modern soldiers still carry. Don't wait for perfect conditions. Adapt, exploit, and move. Those who served in the M8S never saw themselves as heroes. They were scouts, ghosts on the battlefield, doing their job and surviving by inches. But in their speed, their daring, and their ability to make light armor matter, they left behind one of the war's most underrated legacies. Proof in the chaos of World War II, sometimes the smallest guns made the loudest impact. War often glorifies the giants, the Tigers, the Shermans, the machines that towered in strength and crushed by sheer force. But the truth of battle is more subtle. Victory rarely belongs to the strongest. It belongs to those who adapt faster, think sharper, and dare when logic says not to. The M8 Greyhound was born as a compromise, too light to fight, too small to survive. Yet it outlasted expectations and rewrote doctrine by proving that courage and intelligence could amplify even the humblest machine. Its thin armor and modest 37mm gun were never meant to win duels against tanks. They were meant to see, to scout, to report. But in the hands of determined crews, they became instruments of precision, disruption, and defiance. The Greyhound story isn't just about metal and mechanics. It's about human adaptability under impossible odds. Every burned-out hull that still rests in forgotten European fields reminds us, war is not only fought by the mighty. Sometimes it's defined by those who used speed and instinct to outthink fear itself. The M8 Greyhound did not win World War II, but it proved that even the smallest weapon, in the right hands, can change the rhythm of a battlefield forever.